So a brief agenda, we've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about external sharing, external access in Microsoft 365. So first I'll talk a little bit about understanding the options. Then I'll talk about the managing of external sharing. Then we'll move on to auditing in Microsoft 365 with relevance to external access. And finally, we'll look at some options for streamline auditing and how SnapOn Software products can help with that. So we're going to be mixing between slides and demonstrations today. As Armin said in the introduction, if you have some questions, please post them to chat during the course of the presentation today. So firstly, why do we need external access in Microsoft 365? Well, there's lots of reasons. We want to work with customers, suppliers, partners, contractors. We want to capture product feedback, user feedback, product launches. We might want to share an individual file. We want to share a whole site or team, which we want to collaborate on. And we want to collaborate in many different ways. Also, from an IT perspective, we want to stop shadow IT, as it's often called. So people sharing and working with external parties in platforms which we don't control. They might be using Google Drive, Dropbox, Box, or another solution where you're not sure where the data is stored and how it's secured. When we think about external sharing and external access in Microsoft 365, there's three key options: guest users, sharing links, and shared channels. And for those who aren't familiar with them, I'll give you a quick overview of each here and also what they tend to be used for and what I think perhaps some of their limitations are. So guest users share a whole team or a whole site with that user, so they can access all of the files, the channel, the other collaborative elements of that workspace. Sharing links allow us to share an individual file or folder with one or more people, either named individuals or anonymously. Shared channels allow us to share a channel from a team with another organization who is also using Microsoft Teams. Typically, guest users work really well for non-Microsoft 365 users, people who are using personal mailboxes or another form of email, and I'll tell you why in a second. Sharing links work well for where collaboration is not required, so where you're really just sharing an individual file with an individual or many different people, but you don't need to have extensive chat or other collaboration with them. And shared channels works well with other Microsoft 365 users because they can stay within the context of their tenant, and that's really important. The challenge with guest users is they have to switch between their native tenant and your tenant. That's why it works particularly well for non-Microsoft 365 users, because they're not using Microsoft 365, so they haven't got to come from their own teams. Sharing links, one of the big limitations is they're really hard to report on, and we'll look into that during the course of the demo today. And then shared channels, one of the big challenges around those is that they can be a bit unreliable. So they're great because I get to stay in my own tenant, but they can have a few technical issues around them. So good examples are guest users are great for individual contractors. Sharing links are great for things like press releases, price lists, marketing brochures, which you want to share with individuals. And shared channels are great when you're working with a key business partner who's working in Microsoft 365. To share a little bit about what each of those experiences are like, we won't delve into those in too much detail today, but we have published a series of blog posts on each of these. So guest users, you simply add by typing their email address in Teams or SharePoint. They'll receive an invitation, a little bit like you receive that you see on screen, and then they can log in. They have to switch tenants if they're using Teams, and you can enforce things like multi-factor authentication. But essentially, they will become a user of that team and they can access all of the resources in that team. Sharing links is something we've probably all used, whether that's from SharePoint or from OneDrive or from Teams, where we share an individual file or folder. We can manage the type of link, so we can say whether people can edit, whether people can view the files, and we can also define who has access to that link. So whether it's shared to specific groups of people, or it's shared with a specific individual, or it's an anonymous link. From the external party side, they will receive an email. They might need to enter a code. The link might have an expiry date. Finally, we have shared channels. So shared channels is the newest of the three options. That is where you can come in and you can share a channel. There's quite a lot of setup you have to do to make this work. But essentially you can come in and go, I'd like to share that channel with a specific individual. They will then see that channel in their teams, and they'll be able to interact with the chat, the file, and some of those apps. You can again enforce conditional access rules like multi-factor authentication. So what do each of these look like? It's really, really simple. So from within something like Teams, if we're sharing a individual file or folder, we can go into our Teams channel and we can choose to share that with specific individuals. So let's pick a channel. There we go. And from our Files tab, we can go and select an individual file and choose to share it. So we can come here and we can choose Share. A window will come up and I'm asked to type in an email address. So really straightforward. There's some additional settings which I can define around the link. For guest users, it's really simple. We can just go and add a member like we would normally do. And if our team is enabled for guests, we can choose to add them as a guest user. Finally, shared channels. I've got some set up in my tenant here, in my team here. You can go and add a new channel. You must define it as shared. Once that's been shared for the individual channel, just like private channels, you can go in and manage the membership of that individual channel and choose to share it with specific individuals. So those are the three different types of ways we can share information externally. How do we manage that as administrators? How can we put some controls in place to make sure that that is done in a secured manner which we're comfortable with? Well, again, there's different settings which we have to control for different areas. So to manage sharing links, that's largely done in the SharePoint Admin Center. We can control two levels of sharing settings. The first is at the tenant level, so we can control and restrict what's the most level of sharing which can be done from SharePoint or OneDrive. Individual sites and teams can never have a higher level of sharing. We can put additional controls in, such as limiting it to certain domains, controlling what the user can do with the sharing link. And then on an individual site or team basis, we can have different sharing levels. It can never go higher than the tenant level, but we can, for example, say certain sites and teams have no sharing enabled at all. The next thing is sensitivity labels. Normally when I present this in person, I ask people to put their hands up to say how many people use sensitivity labels in their organization. If you don't, I generally suggest you have a strong look at sensitivity labels. They can let you do a lot of different things, but in the context of groups or sites, they let you can control things like sharing, privacy, guest access. So for example, if you set up a label of confidential and assign it to a team, and you've set policies to say this can't be shared externally, then I can't add guest users, I can't share individual files. Sensitivity labels is Microsoft's way of putting some additional controls on that workspace. Finally, with shared channels, we have something called B2B settings. That basically allows us to control which tenants our organization is allowed to share a channel with. Bear in mind, you do have to do setup on the other tenant as well. So that tenant has to be configured to accept your shared channels. So you have to work with the administrators of the customer or organization you're looking to share channels with. Let's have a look at each of those options briefly. So if we firstly go to the SharePoint Admin Center, I firstly can manage the sharing settings across my tenant under policy sharing. This allows me to say, for example, for SharePoint, what's the most permissive? What's the most amount of sharing which could occur? Again, I mentioned individual sites and teams can have that reduced. Same principle for OneDrive. And you'll notice here I've got a number of other settings, so I can control things like what the guest user can do when they've got a link shared with them. One of the most popular ones is going and limiting it to certain domains. Maybe you have certain other organizations within your wider group, but they use they're not within your tenant where you want to share things with. I can also define default behavior for sharing links, and whether the default behavior is view or edit, and also expiry settings globally for my environment. Those settings are also available for individual sites and teams. And I can click on one in the admin center here and go to sharing. By default, it will inherit what my organization says, but I can actually go and reduce that to a different setting for that site or team if I want to lock it down. Those additional settings are also available for an individual site and team if you want them different for one of those workspaces from your default. What are the other settings which we can do? So within Purview, we can control and manage sensitivity labels. Sensitivity labels are a way of classifying both files, but also groups and sites if you've enabled it. I've got one here called confidential, and if I quickly click through it, you can see here that within the section which I define what my label is used for, I make sure that groups and sites is set. And then in that section, I can choose to control privacy and external user access and external sharing and conditional access. What that means is for example, here, I've not allowed external access. That will stop guest users from accessing my team. In this case, I've said sharing links can only be shared within my organization, so they can't be shared externally. Once I've saved and published this label, I can then go and allocate it to certain teams. When I go and create a new team or an existing team, I can choose to assign a specific sensitivity label. Now, products within our portfolio, like Provision Point, can actually automate and control that sensitivity labels are applied to the right sites or team. Otherwise, you could have to trust your users to assign the right ones manually. What that means is then within a team which has that setting assigned, I can't go and share that one externally. So for example, here where this one's set as confidential, if I go and, for instance, try and add a member which is external to my organization, it doesn't let me. I know it's exactly the same principle with sharing links. In terms of our business-to-business collaboration, we can go into our external identities and then go and configure our settings to define which tenants we allow to share channels with externally. We'll give that a second setting to load. Otherwise, when we here we go. So here you can see I've configured a specific organization. You have default settings which you've defined here, where I can go and say, am I going to allow external collaboration? Am I going to allow inbound collaboration? That's really important because you define whether you allow people to come in to your tenant, inbound, or outbound. Do I allow users in my tenant to go and use a shared channel? As I mentioned, you have to set up equivalent settings on both sides for it to work. Let's move back to our presentation and let's move on to auditing. So you'll have seen that in the management side, we can control sharing settings at an individual site or team level. You saw that we can apply sensitivity labels to control sharing and guest access, and shared channels can be managed via Azure to say which tenants we can collaborate with. But how do we go about auditing it? We put some controls, we've allowed our users to start using it, but what can we then do? There's a few different options. Again, it's a little bit disconnected across different areas of SharePoint, Teams, Purview, and Azure. In an individual site, some of the site usage reports give a basic overview of files that have been shared externally. Within the SharePoint Admin Center, we have data access governance reports. These allow us to run scheduled reports which check and tell you which sites have a lot of sharing links. They don't, unfortunately, tell you what those links are, but across your whole tenant, you can see these are sites and teams which have a lot of sharing links. And you'll see by the different types of reports here that we can look at different options here. So For example, we can say run a report to show anyone, or what's commonly sometimes referred to as anonymous links. So a link which, if someone has it, anyone can use. And we can also run a report to show me sites and teams which have external sharing links, but again, not the detail of that. There's a few other areas which we can use. So Entra ID, previously Azure Active Directory, has logs where we can monitor and look at user sign-in events. So that's quite useful for us to go and see, has there been certain events which we can then go and filter and see those activities. Additionally, the Microsoft 365 audit log is great for looking at things like sharing links to see, for example, when a link was shared, has a link been accepted, when a user logged in and accessed those links. So there's a few different options which we can access and understand. The data is not always as tidy and as neat as we would like, but it's a great place for us to start. So let's look at each of those in turn. Firstly, I'm in my SharePoint site here. And as an owner of that SharePoint site, there are some site usage reports available to me. Now, this is not solely about external access, but it can allow me and gives me some data on my individual sharing links. So from the cog here, I can come into site usage under settings. It gives me some basic information about my site, but at the bottom here, it gives me the details of what's been shared with external users. Now, unfortunately, on this initial screen, you can't see who that is, but you can go in here and view permissions and sort of find some additional information about the individual users. Unfortunately, you do have to do that on a site-by-site basis, but it does give me some initial reports. Secondly, under in your SharePoint Admin Center, under reports, you have access to data access governance. Now, these are a more limited set of reports if you don't have SharePoint Premium licensing. But here I can come in here and go to sharing links, and I can go and run these different reports. I ran one a while ago, and this then shows me the sites which have external sharing links in this case. It shows me what the site is, what URL it is, the number of links which have been created, and any other settings such as is external sharing turned on. The detailed report is actually the same information, but it's just in an Excel format for further sharing and analysis. So this will at least pinpoint the sites which have a lot of sharing links, but unfortunately it doesn't give you that granular detail which you may be looking for. Finally, we have a couple of different logs available to us. So for example, under monitoring, we can go to our audit logs and we can filter by different categories in here. Under activities, we can filter by different categories here to find external access events, or via our sign-in logs, we can also see when external users last signed in to our tenant. Hopefully that will load up in a second, otherwise we'll give it a quick refresh. There we go. One of the things which I quite like here is you can put filters on. So I believe it's called user type, and I could, for instance, go and look at guest users. I'm looking at the last 24 hours, but this then covers guests or people using sharing links, named individuals, and I can see those events. I can also drill in a little bit more, so I can pick up things like their email address, date and time they logged into, but it doesn't give me real granular detail around what they're accessing. Additionally, in Purview, you can come in and look at the audit log itself. So this is our Microsoft 365 audit log. And I tend to use the friendly names here to come in and filter by specific types of events. So for example, I could come in here and look for sharing events. And then I can look for, say, for instance, created anonymous sharing link, created a sharing link invitation, accepted an access request. So there's a few different things which we can go and look at here. Now, I ran one a few days ago, just because some of these reports need to run on a scheduled basis or in the background. But here again, similar to the audit, the sign-in logs, I can see some details of who accessed a specific sharing link or who made a sharing link. I can see who was it sent to and what the specific file was. So again, I can get some basic information either from an administrative perspective or from a compliance manager. And it's worth saying we are looking at different roles here. I'm an admin of the whole tenant, so I can see a lot of different things. But you'd need to be a SharePoint admin for the SharePoint admin components. You'd either need to be a Purview admin or a compliance manager role to access the things within Purview, or you'd need to be a global admin to access the logs within Entra, which I showed you. So there is some data which we can get out, but it can be a bit disconnected. So for the final few minutes of the presentation today, I wanted to cover how we help from SnapOn Software if that existing capability is a little bit disconnected or not what you're looking for. So one of our products is called Audit. It's available as a Microsoft Teams app. It's in the Teams store, and it helps organizations with auditing of external access. It covers not only things like guest users and sharing links, it also covers other areas such as storage and orphaned users. And as well as covering administrative reporting, it also allows you to delegate the auditing of reports and sharing links and guest users to the owners of those workspaces as well. So let me show you what that looks like. So I'm still in as my admin user, but if I move across to the Audit app now, you'll see we have a range of reports here covering guest users, sharing links, storage, orphaned objects reports. Within each of those reporting areas, we have a number of different types of reports, dependent on the type. So for example, with guest users, we can look at guest users in a specific workspace, so within a specific site or team. We can see where a guest user has specific access. As an owner, I can come in and run a report to say, just show me the guest users for the teams I'm an owner of. Or I can run a report across my whole tenant and it will show me where are their guest users in my tenant. So in this case, it's showing me I've got these 3 users, the team they have access to, when they were created, whether that request was pending, whether they've been disabled or not. As I mentioned, if I was a team owner, I could come in and run it in the context of me as an individual. So it would then go and say, across your teams, show me the guest users you've got and give me the option to manage those. A similar scenario with sharing links. So instead of having to work in lots of different admin centers or run lots of different reports, I can come here directly and run a sharing links report for a specific site or team, just specifying that in my filter. I can come in here and run a sharing links report for OneDrive only, in this case for a specific individual. So if we've got concerns, either me as an individual, I want to run a report for me myself, or we've got concerns about a specific individual, we can run the report for a specific user. We can run a sharing links report for all of the sites and teams I own. So again, this is a report you could delegate to your site and team owner to say, go and report, go and identify the sharing links which you've got in your organization and take action on shutting down the ones which are not needed. Or my particular favorite is the tenant sharing links report. So this will look across my whole environment. I can limit it to just my sites and teams or just my OneDrives or all of those. And this will then run across all of those and actually identify the different sharing links within my organization. And as an administrator, I can either follow up with the owners or take specific action based on those sharing links. This gives me a great level of detail. It shows me where it is, whether it's coming from a team or a OneDrive location or a site, what file was shared, who it was shared by, so we can see who shared it, when it was shared, who's got access, whether that access is anonymous or not, whether that access has external users or not. And if we needed to provide that data to a compliance manager or as part of an external audit, I can also export that data out to CSV and share it with the relevant people for further review. So I hope you see that our audit app gives you that little bit of additional control and reporting across your environment to help you manage external access and external sharing better. Additionally, which we won't be showing today, we have our provision point product, which allows you to control things like how sharing links, how guest user access is applied across your different sites and teams, as well as enforcing and managing sensitivity labels are applied to the right workspaces as well.